Thank you for joining us for another episode of the Awaken Empowered podcast. I'm Micheila Sheldan. I'm here with Ethann Fox, and we're going to do another audience spotlight today. We had a lot of questions and comments on our various platforms, and some of the comments are actually pretty interesting and spark some good discussion about things that I think people are going through today, including this first one. And it starts like this. I've been into spiritual practices since 2010. It intensified when I started doing chakra meditation around 2016. Since 2019, the third dimensional reality hit me really hard, and I was pushed to participate in it with real life problems. I then stopped doing all of my spiritual practices and became disillusioned with the spiritual world. I thought no matter what I do, we will have to deal with this physical world and its problems, because no matter how patiently and with trust I dealt with them, I couldn't get rid of them. I then became a completely different person. I now don't do meditation or think about guides, angels, dimensions, or quantum energy. I've now started thinking in more realistic ways to deal with this third dimensional world and its real problems, which have to be faced no matter how spiritually evolved we become. And I can relate to this, actually, even though I'm a channel and people out there think I'm probably meditating 24/7. And I do go through periods of time where I meditate quite a bit. What I found in my spiritual awakening is very similar to what this person is talking about, because while meditation was, I think, the agent of awakening in my life, being in that astral place all of the time, I don't believe is really sustainable, nor where we're always meant to be, because to face real world problems, we have to be able to use all of the energy information that we're gaining in those meditative states in, I think, real practical ways. And for me, I meditate less today, way less today, than I did when I first started this journey. And it's not to say that I don't appreciate meditation and all that it offers me. In fact, anytime I'm going into a channeled event or a session, for example, I always sit in meditation for a few minutes and I have my little procedure. And there are times at home when I just feel naturally like it's time for me to sit down and breathe in a specific way. But as far as that regimented program, I feel like meditation integrated with me and changed me in such a way that I am a completely different person because I went through that period of intensified process. And it was, for me, extremely accelerated in that I was meditating 3 times a day for very long periods of time. But I think it was just a window in my world when I was meant to do that. Now, I don't necessarily not think about guides, obviously, because I'm working with them all of the time. But I don't think that's necessary either for some people, to have chosen a physical life and to be here on a physical material planet. I think it's purposeful that there are times we are going to be fully immersed in our material world and even our material problems, which what I've learned are a part of our spiritual journey and especially our service. So there have been times for me where I've naturally fallen out of those meditative periods and I've criticized myself for that. And the guides have come in and said, this is a time when you're meant to attend to the things that are going on in your linear plane. And the purpose for that is because you are here as a channel, because my life is coinciding or corresponding with all of the teachings truly that are coming in. So I feel like I'm always getting a practical lesson in what the guides are teaching and what meditation opens up for me in the world. And I think where we stand today in terms of being embodied and walking into the 5th dimension, it's more important than ever to be here now and to be attending to these physical issues. Because if we don't, we could find ourselves meditating all the way into the 5th dimension and bringing all of the problems right along with us, because I truly don't think we solve them in that state, even though we know meditation is very helpful. So we'll probably get some people who comment about group meditation and raising vibration. And I believe in all of those things. I think those things can be extremely helpful. But if we lean on them exclusively, I think we're missing the point. We're missing the purpose of why we chose to incarnate here at this time. So I go through ebbs and flows with my meditative process, and sometimes it's not here at all, other than as a preface to some type of workshop or class offering that I'm doing, or a session.
We discussed this sort of briefly in our last podcast, in the sense that, yeah, and of course in previous channel revelations recently as well, we touched on the third dimension and fifth dimension and those kinds of concepts. And I think, and even for me, until recent times, I had a misconception about those concepts as well. And I think a lot of us who are on a more conscious path in life, and I don't want to use spiritual, because I think there's a lot of the spiritual movement is just a sort of surface level spirituality. But for those people who are experiencing more of an in-depth spiritual growth and expansion of consciousness, I think we have a tendency to be in a hurry to move toward the fifth dimension, and at least what we think that is. But none of us who are here physically today, unless we have a recollection of experiences in the fifth dimension before, we don't know what that's like. And I don't think it's possible, nor should we, attempt to live in the fifth dimension entirely, because we are here in a third dimensional reality to the extent that we're being impacted by it. So for most of us, especially anybody who's watching this video, you're using the internet, you're using web browsers, you're watching it on YouTube or some other platform. And so these are all third dimensional technologies and communities that you're interacting with. So it's not really possible to completely ignore the third dimension. And of course, you're spending money and buying material things in order to watch the video or listen to it on an electronic device. These are all third dimensional things. So for us to try to shun or get rid of the third dimension in favor of the fifth, it's not possible right now. Now, it's different maybe if you're living in the woods in the middle of nowhere, than that, and you have no contact at all with the external world, and possibly you could do that, but certainly not in any sort of Western society. So I think the real key or the goal should be for us to elevate the third dimension to a higher place, as we discussed in previous conversations, and bring some fifth dimensional elements or ideas into the third dimension and raise it to that higher objective. And that may, in some respect, that may be kind of like what you're doing, channeling, which is not exactly fifth dimensional. It could be any dimensional, really. But you're bringing those information and energy from those higher consciousnesses into the fifth dimension, or into the third dimension, rather. So channeling is more of a fifth dimensional idea, a concept, ability. And through that ability, you are bringing forth this information and vibration into the third and expressing it here for those who are ready to receive or digest or understand that information. So I think more people need to do that, and in whatever way you're doing that, and that may be different for everybody. You could even do it in a more mainstream space. Let's say you're making films. You could make films that are bringing forth these higher concepts into a third dimensional expression. You can do it in any space, really. And to some extent, we're even seeing that happening on a global scale. We're starting to see them move toward more fifth dimensional ideas, but it's not moving at any rapid pace, of course. And I think ultimately that's what we have to do, is to create more of that blend between both. And as I talked about in the last podcast, even free energy technologies, which are in some respects a fifth dimensional idea, but they have to be manifested into the third dimension now. And I think a lot of the problems in the past, where people were inventing cars that ran on water or other kinds of technologies, or even what Tesla was working on, that and many since his time, who have developed actual free energy devices of different types, they were doing it in too large a scale too soon. But if we could do it in small ways, just small things that don't threaten the system, but introduce these ideas into that vibration of the third dimension in those small, innocent ways that nobody cares about, that the mainstream oil companies and power companies and governments don't care. we'll bring it into the consciousness. And as more and more people play around with that and just share it with each other, we're going to find ourselves one day with free energy technology on a more meaningful scale. I think that's what we need to do, as we discussed in the last podcast about how Edgar Cayce brought forth the ideas of channeling. Although there were others before him, he was probably the most well-known. And those individuals in our history who have sort of pushed that boundary have resulted in a world where there's so many channels today, and where it's becoming more and more mainstream. So I think we have to kind of combine both of those ideas, fifth dimension, third dimension, and bring those qualities of the fifth dimension to the third, so that we can elevate the third dimension while we're here. And then as we move into the fifth also is a wonderful place. But I don't think we can ignore the third because we hate it, because there are a lot of things happening in it we don't like, and then think that if we just move to the fifth, everything's going to be perfect. We will still take those third dimensional things that we don't like into the fifth dimension and maybe just elevate to a higher perspective, but still have to live in that dystopia. And that's the choice that we all have available to us today.
Well, I want to speak to the point that she's making about becoming disillusioned with the spiritual movement, because that's happened with me lately. And what I'm reading in this comment, I think has a lot to do with it, because when we first break open to these ideas and we look at the spiritual movement today, a lot of what we see is doing a spiritual practice in order to immediately solve your problem. So we're activating, the law of attraction, or we're meditating with a vision such that we can jump from where we are to where we want to be. And I think what this comment speaks to is that the reality is we're not really here to do that, as much as people believe in that. And I do definitely think that as a race, we have the potential to immediately manifest, but we're not there yet. Nor do I think that immediate manifestation is exactly what we think it would be, because we're not here to jump out of the problem. The problem is where the enlightenment actually happens. So the very idea that you meditate and expand your viewpoint to the point where you see through some of these spiritual mechanisms, programs, right, modalities that perhaps are more about conventional things than they really are about consciousness or enlightenment is actually, I think, happening to a lot of people on the planet today, including myself, especially going through the last several years. And we've talked about this in earlier podcasts, where there's a big difference between spirituality and consciousness. And it's very easy to distinguish now between the two. And certainly I think people can have a foothold in both, or one or the other, or neither. But it's obvious that we really need to go more into a collective consciousness that is aware and expanded in a physical way, in the physical plane, to see the problems and be willing to be with them. And I think that's what meditation actually did for me. Early on, I started having crazy experiences. Obviously, I know that I was a dedicated meditator in many past lifetimes, because without any instruction whatsoever, my body just knew how to go into this deep state and how to breathe to get there. And then when that happened, I was interacting with guides and, ETs, and downloading all of this information, which was a really incredible period of time for me. But what I learned is the more that I did it, the more I was able to bring that state into my physical reality. So I was personally changing in terms of the decisions I would make, who I was in the world, who I wanted to associate with, who my friends were, all of these things, which I think is so, so valuable and so important. So a lot of people are losing faith and, becoming very disillusioned by the spiritual community, because I think of that very reason. We are advancing in consciousness. And as we do, there's a lot of things there that I don't think necessarily can come with us. And we outgrow those things very quickly as well. So as we accelerate in terms of our consciousness, there are just practices that we won't need to do anymore, right? And I think a lot of us have gotten into these states of presence, which I equate to a deep meditation, because the guides will recommend almost always to people who are having trouble with meditation to get into a mindfulness practice where they are just becoming aware of what is ever in front of them. And that is it, doing the dishes, watching the bubbles on your hands, doing the candle flame experiment where you're just staring into the flame and the flicker of the candle and getting so into the present moment that you're in that meditative state without having to get out of the reality you find yourself in. So I think that's the distinguishing factor right now that perhaps is a part of this movement into the fifth dimension, is that we're leaving behind this idea of jumping out of our discomfort using a spiritual practice, but more so being able to sustain uncomfortable periods or challenges in our life and work through them, very consciously. That's ultimately who I think we're becoming.
I think there's a misconception about manifestation that really the law of attraction in some ways amplified in the recent decades. And that is that, well, first of all, you're talking about instantaneous manifestation. First of all, mechanically, I don't think that's possible in the third dimension. And of course, the guides have even said we came here to experience time and to have to wait for things, and so it's really a benefit or an advantage or a privilege to be here. Although many of us here who want things right away may not feel that way, but we came here in order to experience that. I mean, imagine if you spend most of your incarnations in higher dimensions where instantaneous manifestation is possible, then that's normal. I can see why, as a soul, you may want to try something different and be in a reality where there's time and density and you have to wait for things to manifest. And plus, the third dimension is a very egocentric reality. So we are all separate from each other. So we're, from that standpoint, if everybody had instantaneous manifestation, imagine if our world leaders had instantaneous manifestation, what kind of dystopia we'd be living in today. When you're living in a reality that is so separate, where we are individuals and each of us is unconscious or uncaring of each other, especially in modern times in the world today, to where if we could instantaneously manifest, we would cause so much harm on the planet. Even if all we wanted was more money or more things that we want without paying attention to anybody else, those actions would nonetheless affect everybody else in a collective consciousness, even though we are operating as separate egos. And I think that's where you have to associate instantaneous manifestation more so with higher dimensions. So as we move the fifth, sixth, seventh, eighth, and so on, manifestation will become quicker because we are getting to a point where our decisions and the things we're trying to manifest are more in alignment with the collective. And secondly, it's kind of a chicken or egg thing. I think, first of all, I've studied law of attraction and applied it and even studied under coaches who were in the secret. So I've got a lot of experience with the principles and theories and mechanics of it. And I can tell you, and I think if anybody's being honest, they would admit that law of attraction doesn't work all the time. So you may have something on your vision board and maybe some things actually work and some things may even appear to work instantaneously. And other things, they never work. And I experienced this with different groups of people I worked with. As I said before, I worked with John Assaraf, who was in The Secret, as a personal coach for a period of time. And we were in this very small group of individuals who were working with him as a private coach. There were maybe 12 or 15 of us in this group, and they were all pretty successful people and in different lines of work. Some of them very successful and others at lesser degrees. And I watched, all of us following John's techniques. And at the time, he was considered the most advanced in the law of attraction space for using the mind to manifest. And so he was teaching some, at that time, very advanced techniques. And we were all applying it. And some of us in the group, we became more successful. Some of us in the group kind of stayed the same. And some of us went backwards and even went bankrupt in the span of time that I was in this program. So here you are, we're working with the most expert person in the field of law of attraction in terms of manifestation and vision boards and neuroentrainment and things like that, and in a group of very successful people, and yet we couldn't all produce the same results. And that just goes to show that law of attraction is not consistent. It isn't a law that produces consistent results every time to everybody who applies it to the same degree. And the reason is because not all of us are supposed to have the same things. So it isn't really possible. And that's why it requires a collective consciousness really to have those kinds of things, because in a ego-centered society or dimension, each of us may be making decisions for our own benefit or the benefit of those around us. Meanwhile, our decisions are affecting the whole collective anyway. And that's not a power, I think, that would make sense to have mechanically in a third dimensional reality. So in the instances where instantaneous manifestation actually does occur, it's more that you were always meant to have that in the first place. And I think that's the distinction we need to get to as we move to fifth dimensional consciousness, because I think law of attraction is distinctly third dimensional. I think in a fifth dimensional consciousness, you begin to realize that the things you want are the things you were always supposed to have. So instead of putting things on a vision board that you want to achieve, you start to become aware of the things that you are always going to have. And you start striving for those things intentionally. So instead of all of us putting $1 million on a vision board or the fancy car or the perfect relationship, we all individually begin to become conscious of our next step in the journey, what we came here to experience and do and who to be with and how much money to have or not have. And we start to strive for those things. And in so doing, we start to get into alignment with what we are here to experience. And at that point, instantaneous manifestation happens because you're walking the path you're always going to. You start to want the things that you were always meant to have anyway. And you're not constantly up against your own resistance trying to accomplish something that you're not meant to have, while your life is still pulling you toward what you're going to have anyway. And I think that's the thing, a misunderstanding that exists in our understanding of that.
I agree with you about the instantaneous manifestation being about alignment, because I actually had instantaneous manifestation experiences, and they're more like synchronicities and stepping out of resistance than anything else. So my famous story when I began to channel was that Christmas morning, I was cooking a dinner for my entire family, big Italian family, always had them at my house. And I was missing some very key ingredients that I needed to make this special, roast, whatever I was doing. And had forgotten to buy them. It was Christmas morning. Everything was closed. And I was really stressed out about it because I had this dinner party, all these people coming to my house. And at the time, I was meditating for the purpose of pain. So anytime I would feel stressed, I would go straight into meditation, knowing that, I was trying to keep my inflammation and pain down, but had no request whatsoever, right? Nothing in my head saying, I need to fix this situation. Please let me manifest the ingredients I need. But it happened anyway, because I went into meditation that day, deep, deep meditation, had a crazy experience with a guy named Jacob, came out the door and found the ingredients sitting in my kitchen pantry. After I went on this crazy exploration of looking on every shelf. Now, I can't truly explain that other than that timeline is more balanced and harmonized than the one I was on I was stressed out about. So maybe I jumped timelines. Maybe it was just a synchronistic shift into a reality where those material things came into my tangible use. However, what I have noticed is when I do meditate regularly, which, as I mentioned earlier, I go through ebbs and flows with that. Right now, I'm not doing it, but I do go through periods where I do. I notice the synchronicity in my life tends to become very, very vivid. For example, there was a period in time when I was meditating every morning. I was calling in my higher self and just saying, help me today, guide me to the things that I need to know, do, where can I serve, how can I be served? I had this kind of open-ended prayer. And I would have a thought that there was something that I would need and immediately see a sign of it in the environment. Like, gosh, I'm going to have to find a handyman to fix that leaky plumbing. And then see a handyman truck literally drive right past me on the street. So I do think meditation can help us get into a non-resistant state where the source field does all of the things that it would naturally do for us that we get in the way of. And that's how instantaneous manifestation actually happens in a third dimensional reality. But because we've been so trained to try to use it to get rid of things we don't want, we can't figure out how, right, to implement it in our lives. So naturally, I think meditation will do that for us. It just gets us out of our own way. It limits the resistance that we have so that we can see things that we did not know were there. And maybe the ingredients were there all along. I just didn't see them. And that meditation opened me up to be able to realize something was there that wasn't before.
You know, it reminds me of when in the years when I was working with John Assaraf and studying The Secret very intently, and this is long before I met you. I was in a different relationship at the time and had we were just started our marketing agency at the time, and we had one car that we shared. It was just a very average car. And of course, working with John Assaraf and vision boarding, and this is in the early years of The Secret coming out. And of course, that's when I found out about Esther Hicks and all these other people and channeling and whatnot. Not my first exposure to channeling, but anyhow. So every day of the week, I was practicing what John was teaching and had my vision board with all this stuff on it, and all the material things that we strive for in law of attraction. One of which was I wanted a better car. And so I had all these luxury sports cars, some of them sports cars, on the vision board. And I was visualizing it. I was going to car dealerships and test driving cars that were way out of my price range that I would never be able to afford. At that time, realistically, and sometimes doing it, you feel a little weird because you're sitting in this car that you know you can't afford with a salesman who doesn't know you can't afford it, but you're test driving it anyway. So these are the kind of things we do, right? When we're pushing the envelope with the law of attraction, when we believe in those principles, and well, not long after that, we were driving home in the middle of the night. It was about 2:00 in the morning. On the highway, and a raccoon ran out in front of my car, and I swerved to avoid it, and in response I flipped the car over. So the car rolled over, and we were fine, but at any point we couldn't drive it, so we had to spend the night at a hotel nearby. And while we were there, we started looking at brochures for cars online, because we were not going to be able to drive that car again. And sure enough, we ended up buying a car that was unrealistic for us to have considered buying at that time. It pushed the envelope of what we thought was possible. It was a luxury car, but it was not quite to the extent of the cars that I had been test driving, but certainly quite a ways along the way. And at the time, there was no way we could have afforded that car. But in a short amount of time, we had paid the car off, and much less time than the original car we had. And but the point of the story is that this was something that was in the vibration already. But you may sometimes produce a result in a way that you're not expecting, right? I mean, nowhere in my vision board did I get in a car accident, smash the old car up, and have to buy a new one. So sometimes manifestation kind of works in that way. You still have the experience you're always meant to have. Now, did I put the exact car on my vision board? No. The cars that I had on my vision board were in an entirely different range, but I ended up happy with the one that I had anyway. So that's the thing I think we have to consider is manifestation, law of attraction isn't always a precise thing to where you put it on the board and you get exactly what you want and the way that you imagine it being. you're going to still end up where you're supposed to be. But occasionally you may put things on the board that are on your path anyway. Like, I was already on the path to having a nicer car. I just didn't know what that car was going to be. And so in my own intuitive way, putting these things on the vision board produced a result in a way that I wouldn't have chosen, but nonetheless produced that result.
This is an interesting conversation stemming from this one comment, but I want to carry it on because I think the opposite is true as well. So I always say, I don't think that we're here to manifest everything in this life from nothing. We have a divine plan, and so we're co-creating with that divine plan, right? Which leads to the timing issue that, with the car. But there was a time when I was single, and I was studying law of attraction, and there was a guy in my life that I was very attracted to, and really wanted to become a part of my romantic experience. And we talk about reptilians and the mind and how powerful the mind is, and we do have that. So I just want to throw this in there. I do think the mind is extremely powerful in terms of magnetic attraction. And I did the same thing. I was focusing on this guy, focusing on a life with him. But what I found was I was attracting him into my life and his friends and all kinds of activities in ways that made it more painful because I wasn't exactly getting what I wanted. And the relationship never came to fruition. And now looking back, I'm so glad that that did not happen because that was not meant to be. However, his friends wanted to be my friends. There was always this kind of promise that we were going to get together that kept falling through, or he would stand me up, and so it just the attraction was there. The energy I was pulling in, but it was obvious to me when I got to the other side that this was never meant to be a part of my soul's experience. And, I think this is where these spiritual practices, when we don't have the full foundation of them that's available to us, maybe as we're walking into the fifth dimension, we're learning more, they can cause us a lot more suffering than what is necessary, because when we make it so specific like that, and I think that's the thing, is we make it so specific. There's this one thing we want, this one thing we need, this one thing we need to heal or kick in our lives. Then we get so entangled in that and we start thinking about it that we draw in more problem than we really are meant to experience. Whereas in a meditative practice, if we're keeping ourselves open and unconditional, just for the highest and best good of whatever is meant to come our way, then I think that's where those synchronicities happen. And we have these really clear signs that come in about, what is meant to happen. And we see how Source really wants to support us. And that's what I think we're really moving into.
Yeah, it was one last thing so I don't want to get stuck on this first question, but mentioning John, so this individual is considered a master in that space of law of attraction. I know a lot of people wholeheartedly believe in the law of attraction as a hard and fast rule, but John's company went bankrupt soon after I stopped working with him. And I always make the comment, here's a guy who probably knows more about law of attraction and how to produce those results than anybody. And he, to be fair, was a multimillionaire at the time that I knew him. But I'm sure he didn't put on his vision board to have his company go bankrupt. But obviously it was an experience he was meant to have. And I find, for example, using numerology and astrology, at the end of your 9-year cycle, there's usually some sort of collapse that occurs. Doesn't matter how good you are at law of attraction. The things that are meant to be taken away from you will. That's been true for me every 9 years that happens to me. And so even in the case of someone like him, doesn't matter what he had on his vision board. If that was supposed to happen, it's going to happen anyway. You can't force your will upon the universe with law of attraction and manifest things that are not meant to be for you on this journey. Which is a good thing, because in our ego selves, we don't know everything. We can't see everything. We are too self-absorbed in our own experience to be able to see the bigger picture. But our soul's journey, our higher consciousness and awareness chose these paths for us and put them in motion. So like in his case. Now, the other thing too is, knowing his astrology chart, I could tell he was always going to be rich. So we could look at him and say, well, sure, he could apply law of attraction techniques and he'll probably end up rich anyway. Whereas somebody else who does not have the kind of astrology and numerology he has, using the same techniques, would not produce the same results. So did law of attraction work exceptionally well for him because he was just good at it? Or did it work for him because this was supposed to be his journey anyway? But even inside of that, the things that he was meant to fail in, he was going to fail anyway. So at the end of the day, do we really need law of attraction? Do we really need to try to attract and bring into manifestation the things we think we want? Or do we just need to get into alignment with what we came here to do and experience and have anyway, and just flow toward that in non-resistance? And instead, being in alignment with that, we can work with those influences to create what we came here to create anyway.
Next question is about astrology, interestingly. So what chart should we look at in a romantic relationship? The basic synastry, composite, or Davison chart?
I find that they're all useful. So I wouldn't say any one chart. I use all of them, but I find I use the synastry the most. Rather, I find it to be the most useful in terms of understanding the two individuals. But the other charts are also good. I also sometimes will use a composite chart. There are certain things that I can see in a composite that I may not be able to see in the synastry, or it may even confirm things that are in the synastry. So I would say use them all, but I find that comparing the two charts, the individuals, to each other is the most beneficial. Now I have studied astrology on my own for about 30 years now, and also practiced professionally. And I would say that there are a lot of misconceptions in the astrological space about compatibility. A lot of people believe that, and of course, if you look at it from a textbook standpoint, sometimes it might make sense. But a lot of people believe that certain kinds of influences always produce great results or great relationships. It's not necessarily true. And I also find sometimes you have to combine the numerology. I find it incredibly insightful, even if two astrological charts are incredibly harmonious, and the numerology of the two individuals. For example, I was just discussing this with Micheila recently about my observation about individuals who have a number one soul in their first name. So essentially, all the vowels in your first name equal one. If you put two of those people together in a relationship, it doesn't matter how good the astrological comparison is, those two people are going to have a hard time seeing each other's needs, and they're always going to be striving for themselves and their own needs. And they're going to either butt heads or go their separate ways in the relationship, because the one first name soul number makes it very hard for you to see outside of yourself. And a lot of times there can be anger issues and more likelihood to fight with each other, because the ego is very strong with the one person. And one people, not necessarily ill-intentioned, but have a hard time being able to see outside of what they want, what they need, even if they're making an effort to see what the other person wants and needs. So I find that certain combinations of numerology between two people also don't work, even if the astrological combinations are perfect. But looking at the astrology specifically, there are certain influences that I look for and certain influences that I try to avoid two people having. And if those influences are there or not there, depending on which, all the other influences I find to be secondary. For example, the relationship between Venus and Saturn between two people, I think, is one of the most important things in a romantic relationship. Because if, for example, a person has Venus square Saturn between themselves and the other person's chart, and in some cases I see it both ways, where one person's Venus is square the other person's Saturn, and that person's Venus is square the first person's Saturn, it doesn't matter if everything else in the chart is great. If that is there, it's going to be very hard for those two people to express love and warmth toward each other. That's one of the main influences that I look for initially in a chart between two people. Now, if that does not exist, or the Venus and Saturn are more harmonious, say in a trine or a sextile, for example, then that may be okay. But even better if you have a Venus-Sun influence between the two charts, a Venus sextile the other person's Sun. That is kind of the opposite, where it enhances the love and the warmth between two people. Now, there are other things too, such as Moon and Sun influences I find also very critical. It tells you a lot about the relationship. For example, if you have Sun square Saturn between a couple, that relationship may have been a relationship out of practicality and not so much, not so much for the relationship itself. And it could be maybe they got together because of career or because of they had children or something like that. And a lot of times that relationship will stay together because of that square, even though it may lack good qualities of a happy relationship. So it's a much more complex conversation than we can have here, but there are very specific influences I look for, and then you cannot ignore the numerology, because that, even if everything's great in the astrology, and the two people do have love and warmth, but they're very self-centered because of the one, they can still have a hard time taking care of each other, because, I mean, ultimately in a romantic relationship, if you're not going to take care of each other, then why be in a romantic relationship? And that's a thing with 2-1 soul numbers, especially when it's in the first name, you have a hard time looking out for each other. You're even if you're good intentioned, you unavoidably may be looking out for yourself and not be able to see the other person.
This is another interesting comment, not necessarily a question. When I go up in frequency, it creates turmoil in my nervous system, and I'm not built for that. So I love to go lower in vibration by being silent, going in nature, moving slow, and I still move forward. And I think this is a valid point. I had an interesting post the other day from the book that I put up about being in bliss all the time. And I think we talked about this in the last podcast, where we assume we always want to be of higher vibration, but there's a lot of detail in the book about the idea that vibration isn't everything. I mean, certainly as we move up in dimension, we are moving up in vibration collectively and individually. But just because our vibration is low for an hour or a day or a week or a period of time doesn't hold us back from evolving nor from manifesting the things that we want. So the attraction piece vibrationally is really only a small part of the equation. And I'll give you an example. In the book, The Guides Use Relationship, actually, and they talk about, if a partner is mad at the other because they came home late for dinner, and, they cooked a surprise dinner and their partner wasn't thinking and didn't get home until 2 hours late, and the dinner went cold. And, of course, it's going to be anger. It's going to be sadness. It's going to be all of these things, right? And throughout the duration of that entire event and beyond, the vibration is calculating what they call an imprint. And that imprint is what colors the memory of that experience. So if we are angry and we never resolve it, we never look our partner in the eye and say, gosh, I'm really sorry that there was this misunderstanding, right? We kind of neutralize all of that anger. Then we're going to be afraid to come home late during that relationship throughout the duration of it. And as a matter of fact, an entire relationship is colored by an imprint. So you could be with someone for 30 years, and the vibration that's contributed to that relationship is always going to form an imprint. And that imprint will carry with you into the next life. And that's how traumas repeat, right? And all of these things. So I don't think it's necessarily a big deal that we always have to focus on being of high vibration, but we have to be aware of, and we talked about this last time, our emotions and how we're processing them and consciously working through them. So when we're angry, when we're upset, it's okay. It's okay to have that feeling. It's okay that the vibration exists behind it. What we're attempting to do is be conscious within it and neutralize it. And then it's no problem. But I also think that what she's saying here has a lot to do with what we've learned about reptilians. And I'm not saying that this person is a reptilian in a negative way. There are really loving, enlightened, supportive, wonderful reptilians that have been here throughout history. They're still supporting humanity, I believe, today. And those who are of more of a reptilian nature or other cosmic families, inner earth beings, dragons, elementals, are going to love that slower material nature like vibration, being in silence. I love that personally. I have throughout, my period of spiritual awakening and beyond really became quieter and quieter and quieter because, to me, it's really helpful to have those periods of silence to deal with a world in chaos, right? So I just wanted to make that point. I don't think being of high vibration all of the time is really what we're going for. And the fact that it creates turmoil in this person's nervous system, that doesn't surprise me. I think when those of us who are here are constantly reaching for that higher vibration, we're putting a lot of pressure on ourselves. And there are some people who are so sensitive. I'm very sensitive to things like sound healings, crystal bowls, light therapies. I mean, we really have to be cautious with all of that because I know even for myself, I've learned along the way that I really can't get involved in all of that stuff constantly. And if I do, it does rattle my nervous system, quite a bit. So we all have to find that sweet spot, I think, where we know how vibration affects us and where we do best in terms of our own frequency.
Yeah, I'm not sure I understand the question. And so let me just kind of hash out some things. And because I think in the spiritual space, we use a lot of terminology that kind of overlaps and means different things, and we use it interchangeably. And so sometimes one person's saying one thing and they mean another thing. And I may be hearing another thing. So when I hear vibration, being somebody who works with energy, I think of it as like frequency. Or, for example, if I deliberately lower my vibration, I wouldn't think that's a good thing because I may start interacting with lower vibrational entities and things, and certainly I've known a lot of people over the years in the spiritual space who had different kinds of lower entity attachments and darker experiences because their vibration was very low. And to lift them out of that, you have to raise their vibration. So I don't think you ever want to be there unless you're intentionally wanting to interact with lower dimensions, right? So that's how I'm interpreting the question when we're talking about vibration. But I'm wondering if how you're interpreting the question is more having to do with like positivity versus negativity. Is that what you're meaning?
Yeah. It's hard to know what she's saying here, but what my takeaway is she says she loves to go lower in vibration. And to me, that's just slowing down the speed of life, right?
Okay.
And not going so quickly into all of these spiritual modalities, spending more time in nature, being silent at times, as opposed to always going.
Yeah, I guess I don't see that as vibration in my vantage point.
You're right. I think that people do use that terminology completely differently. And when I think of lower vibration, it leads me to believe that maybe there are negative entities or suffering, right? Or things like that. But again, I don't want to make it too technical, but that's where my mind goes because I've done so much channeling is the more time we spend in suffering, the more density we create. And density is a filter, like a thick energetic filter that exists in our field. And it suppresses our ability to perceive consciously, and especially to perceive the solutions to our problems, right? Which are all around us, like we talked about a minute ago in the instantaneous manifestation. So I don't necessarily think that density has to slow our speed of vibration to a specific degree, but it can, right? So I think the choice that she's making is she's slowing down the speed of vibration and it feels happy to her. It feels good to her to have those moments of being immersed in nature and just being silent and not doing, right, all of these things. Yeah. And it's a different way of defining it.
Well,
Absolutely.
I would interpret that as vibration, at least the way she's describing it, because I think being in nature is higher vibration.
It is. You're right. Yeah.
So she's not, at least the way she's using the terminology,
maybe a more material experience.
Is not how I would interpret it. I mean, I think being in nature is higher vibration,
right,
than not being in nature. So I mean, a lot of
for
people.
some people.
Well, a lot of people throughout history have gone into nature to restore and recover, and many have enlightenment experiences in nature, right?
Right.
So I don't think it's a place. Now, nowadays everything's toxic, so even nature is toxic. But you know, the idea still exists, and I think what she's describing is not what I would call vibration, but I would call more of like a state of being. You know, personally, I think we should all strive to be in a higher vibration all the time. But and she's saying she's happy, right? You can't be in a lower vibration, in my opinion, at least the way that I use the term vibration, and be happy. I think happiness implies that she's in a higher vibration. So, but she's using a terminology, I think, in a different way. She's more describing like stillness, calmness, which I don't think are low vibrational, right? I think those are higher vibrational experiences. So that's where I would sort of disagree with the terminology use, or rather redefine it in my own way anyway.
As a sensitive, I understand what she's saying. For example, when she says, when I go up in frequency, it creates turmoil in my nervous system. So for me, you know, sometimes I'll look for a hertz frequency to play, you know, like a sound healing while I'm meditating. And there are all kinds of them out there that are supposed to help you heal and get into certain states, right? And sometimes, I would say more times than not, the majority of them do rattle my nervous system, even though they're supposed to be very beneficial. So I think a good point to make is that we're not all built to constantly go into these higher frequencies spiritually and using these various modalities like sound. And, you know, we're all built completely differently, and we should follow that, because if we don't listen to it and we just go with the stigma that everything's supposed to support us, and we don't tune in uniquely to what really does help us feel good, then we're going to scramble our entire system. And, you know, I've definitely had that experience before, and I've learned to walk out of things when, right, it just isn't feeling right to me.
I think it has to do with you being tuned to a particular frequency, right? So everybody has their normal state that they exist in, and they're all different. Some people are existing in a very high frequency normal state. Other people are existing in a very low frequency normal state, and there are people all across the board in between. And that normal state is where you feel at rest or comfortable. And I think when you go too far to one extreme or the another, it's going to feel uncomfortable at first because it's not something you're familiar with. It's kind of like the analogy of a piano that's been out of tune for a long time. First time you tune it, it loses its tune very quickly because it's not used to being in tune. But the more frequently you tune it, it holds a tune longer. And it's because the frequency is being adjusted in a manner of speaking. And the more you adjust it, the more you get comfortable in that higher frequency or new frequency until that becomes your new norm. And then it'll feel awkward and weird to you to go to the one you were before all along. And so I think that's a factor to consider as well. And I'm not so sure. I think you understand what she's saying, in her description of frequency, because you're sensitive. I am not a sensitive. And so I'm not understanding in a personal way what she's describing, which you can understand, right? I'm more understanding it in a mechanical person who works with energy kind of way.
Right.
But I can sort of get it. But I would frame it differently, just simply because my understanding of frequency is a little bit different than how she's using the terminology. And I don't think anybody should want to exist in a lower frequency unless there's a purpose for doing that. Experimentation, working with lower vibrational entities. Sometimes people do that. Or if you're a medium and you need to do that to do what you came here to do, then maybe you would lower your frequency and operate there in order to communicate with the beings who are there. But, you know, somebody like me, if I were to lower my frequency to that level, then I would probably attract all kinds of negative things into my energy field. And just my ability to do energy transfers is a factor of my ability to hold a higher frequency in the first place. So people can send dense things to me or even entity attachments, and they don't affect me because I'm not in that lower frequency. So that's kind of how my interpretation of that would be.
I guess the question is, this is just an interesting concept. Can we slow the speed of vibration without negatively affecting our frequency? I actually think that we can, because we came here in physical bodies, and the guides say we wanted to slow down the speed of material experience to savor each moment. But that doesn't necessarily mean we had to be vulnerable to lower dimensional beings, right? And disease and all of these things. So it's an interesting thing to ponder that, I think there's a stigma around lower vibration. And is it really something? Certainly if we're in a lower vibrational state for a long period of time and we're accumulating a lot of density, and that density is attached to a story, we're going to become vulnerable to negative entities, chronic disease, right? Emotional issues, all that stuff. But I think we can slow the vibration of our experience, but not necessarily lower the frequency through which not accumulate density is what.
Yeah.
So I think that's what this point is trying to get across. And I do have a weird understanding.
Yeah, I think you do, whereas I don't.
Yeah.
Because I also have an electronics background. So as you're speaking, I'm seeing sine waves, and I'm seeing, back in the olden days when we had oscilloscopes. So you probably don't even know what oscilloscope is, but you do know what oscilloscope is?
No, I don't know.
Okay. So anyway, back in electronics classes, we used oscilloscopes in the Stone Age. Maybe they still do today. I don't know. But anyway, when I hear frequency, I sort of think of electronic waves of frequency too. For example, if you have an AM radio, the frequency that an AM radio tunes in is a different frequency than the microwave frequency that a cell phone tunes in.
Right.
You can't get an AM radio to play, or rather you can't get a cell phone to play what's on a AM radio and vice versa, because they're two entirely different frequencies. So if you lower, for example, an electronic device, in just as an example here, to the frequency of an AM radio, it's not going to start receiving the information that's on the AM band.
Right.
Whereas an electronic device that's set up to tune in microwave frequencies is now going to be receiving information that's on the microwave frequency. So why would an individual want to intentionally lower themselves to a frequency level where the information that exists there is information that could make life difficult, or even lower vibrational entities that are suffering and wanting to cause misery? Now you're tuning in all of that, right? And I think a lot of people, when they get stuck there, they can't get themselves out of there. Now, with the exception of, I think, more evolved souls, more advanced souls who are able to work with these things, I don't think it's a problem. I think then you could go to the lower depths of darkness and play around there and then come back right out of it and go back to the higher levels, and it has no effect on you. The vast majority of people, though, I'll tell you a story. I have two younger brothers, and this is a long time ago. This is when I was maybe in my 20s or early 20s, maybe. And the middle brother did not believe in spirituality or any of the kind of things that we are talking about today. He probably still doesn't. He's a very materially oriented person. That's where he is experiencing life in this journey. And he had a girlfriend at the time, and he went to her house, and all the girls were, they were, I think, in their late teens. He was as well. And they were playing around with a Ouija board, which, back then I didn't know much about them. I knew what they were, and I was sort of very new in studying spirituality and consciousness and metaphysics and these things. But I knew enough about energy, and in concept, I understood these things. And so he went to this, to somebody's house, and they were all playing around with the Ouija board. He didn't believe in any of it. It was not in his level of understanding. He thought it was just a game. And he didn't participate. He just watched them do it, and then he left. And now this is spirituality and these metaphysics were not things that he and I ever talked about because it made him uncomfortable and he thought I was a little strange that I believed in these things. But he came to me one day, several weeks later, with a problem, and that he felt like only I could help him understand. What was happening was, he was living at my parents' house at the time, and he was telling me he'd stay up late studying. He was in college at the time, and he would fall asleep at his desk studying with the lamp on his desk. And he would wake up the next day and the lamp would be off. And he thought, I don't remember turning that lamp off. And so the next day, same thing would happen. He'd wake up at his desk and the lamp would be off. And so he thought maybe he's going crazy. So the next night he decided he was going to unplug the lamp, or rather, I can't remember. He did something different to sort of test out what was going on. And he woke up the next day and the light bulb was unscrewed and sitting on the desk. And he knows he didn't do that. And so he came to me to find out what's going on because he also started to feel some strange presence in his bedroom and in the basement, and it was starting to freak him out a little bit. And so I explained to him this was something obviously came through this Ouija board, which is a tool that's used to draw in lower vibrational entities, right? And so this followed him around. Of course, I did some energy kind of things and got rid of that problem. But the point is, and essentially all I did was I raised the vibration of the space, and raising the vibration of the space got rid of the problem. So when I hear these questions about or comments about vibration, that's what I think of is my experience in that area. Now, maybe some people would like having a lower vibrational entity following them around unscrewing light bulbs. But I think the vast majority of people are a little bit weirded out by those kinds of experiences and don't want to live in that place. So I think maintaining the higher frequency, at least from my vantage point of what frequency means, is where we should be, right? But I think we're agreeing on this. We're just using different terminology, right? Or rather, interpreting the terminology she's using in two entirely different ways.
Yeah, I think, the bottom line here is just because something claims to be higher frequency does not mean it's going to raise your vibration. Mm-hmm. I think that's a good point to consider, even, not knowing exactly the purpose behind this comment. But, there are a lot of things out there that you can tune into, but just because they claim they're going to be higher frequency, you may not feel that, and it may rattle your nervous system. And then you should know right away instinctually, not for you. Yeah. All right, let's move on. So we've had quite a few comments actually over the last couple of months about, people who are losing hope with the world and the direction that we're going. For example, some people saying they remember volunteering to come here, but they wish they hadn't, or they jumped too quickly and they're not sure that the world's going in the right direction, or, with the plans that the World Economic Forum and, others are rolling out, they're not seeing the possibility of us being free at all. So how do you find hope right now? And do we even know that the earth is going in the right direction?
Well, I know it's hard, but if you can imagine, if for those of you who are in the United States and for those of you who are not, who may be familiar with U.S. history, the last time Pluto entered Aquarius was in the late 1700s. And if you can imagine for a moment what it was like to live in the United States during that time of turbulence in this country where a foreign power was trying to take over, and we're repeating the same cycle again now. Now, many of us may even have imagined, sometimes you may think, well, what must it have been like to live in the time of Rome? I mean, some of us probably were there, but to remember what it was like, or to remember what it was like to live in the United States during the time when the all these revolutions were taking place, and a foreign power was trying to take control and establish a new governmental system, and it became a place of freedom for a period of time. we're experiencing that again now. And we can see in real time what that must have been like in modern times, of course. I mean, they didn't have the technologies and the kind of things we have today, but ultimately the experience was probably very similar. Those people then were in a less technologically advanced world, but they were probably feeling and experiencing very similar things as we are experiencing today. And the feeling of loss of hope, the feeling that there are foreign powers taking over the US and really the world, or even if you consider, I think a lot of these foreign powers it's more of a Marxist movement that's taking place in the world today. And if you consider even Karl Marx and all of the damage that he did in the countries that he influenced, and or even Hitler, for example, these were all times when people in those societies supported these leaders in doing the nefarious things they did. They followed them, they worshipped them, as we're seeing today. And we wouldn't be able to. People like or the Klaus Schwab or World Economic Forum or the WHO or our U.S. government, for example, they wouldn't be able to take control and do the things that they're doing today if people didn't support them. If there wasn't a segment of the population of the world who were not completely behind it. And so we are experiencing that same phenomena today, what it must have been like to live in a time when there are all these things taking place, where there are individuals who are attempting to take control and to take away people's rights and disempower them, and where a strong number of the population supports that and are enabling that behavior. But what will happen, as has happened every other time that these kinds of events have occurred, is that eventually those things change and the pendulum swings the other way. Now, as I've talked in previous shows, I believe that the last year was really the end of, based on astrological cycles anyway, the end of the pendulum swimming to one extreme, to where we had extreme dystopia and control on the planet, and all of these various things that came along with it. And now what's happening is the pendulum is starting to slowly swing the other way. It may not be obvious yet to most people, but now I watch hundreds of videos and read a lot of books, and so I'm familiar with not only what's happening in the popular culture, but many other things as well. And I can tell you that the signs are there that we are starting to swing the other way. So now it's going to take time. It took decades for the pendulum to swing to this extreme. I think really it started in the 1800s. Second half of the 1800s, I think, is when we really started, in the U.S. anyway. And I think the U.S. is just maybe a larger representation of what's happening globally. So everybody's feeling the same things, but I think it was in the 1800s when we first moved away from a free country that the U.S. was established as in 1700s, late 1700s, to becoming more of an enslaved society. And then in the 1920s and 30s, we took another big leap forward, for example, with the establishment of the Federal Reserve and the Internal Revenue Service in the U.S. And then in the 1970s, where we went off the gold standard in the U.S., and also we had various movements that political, social movements that now have reached their culmination. So we're seeing establishment of the CIA, all these things, for example, happen in these time periods. We're seeing even the NIH, for example, in the 1970s, the NIH, Anthony Fauci, all these things were escalated during this period of time. And now we just are 1 year ago at the extreme of the pendulum swinging in that direction. A pendulum that started swinging 100 some years ago, or 200 years ago, something like that, late 1800s. And now we're going to see the pendulum swinging the other way. And what that's going to look like is all of these control systems and institutions like the World Economic Forum, which, no coincidence, was established in 1971. So Klaus Schwab came into power in the World Economic Forum in 1971. So we're seeing, it was really the 70s that started the acceleration point of this pendulum swinging. And now all of those things that were set up to control society more and cause all the hardship that we're seeing today are going to start collapsing and falling apart as the pendulum swings the opposite extreme. Now, is it going to be easy? No, I mean, I think a lot of people are going to struggle and maybe suffer because of this system collapsing. And as a result of it collapsing, a lot of things in our society are going to get disrupted. But meanwhile, we're going to see a move toward greater freedom. So I think it will take 20, 30 years of the pendulum swinging the opposite direction, but we are eventually going to get to a neutral point, which I think is like the early 2030s, 2033, when the pendulum will be swinging more toward the middle, to where we'll see a lot of what we see today has fallen apart or is on the verge of falling apart, and then in the process, we'll start rebuilding a better society, a society that is not under the control of these individuals. Similar thing happened in the 1700s, and then we'll have, we'll be moving toward a freer society, a society where people actually care about each other again. One of the other things that you and I all a lot of times talk about is how whenever you see a Marxist society anywhere in the world, communist Marxist society, let's take China as an example, because they've been a communist society for a good part of this past century. And the longer a society is Marxist and communist, the more corrupt the regular people become. Now, obviously, the government is already corrupt in a communist society from the beginning, but what happens is the people become corrupted. And when the people become corrupted, they start taking advantage of each other, they start criticizing each other, they stop taking care of each other, their relationships deteriorate, their marriages get divorced. It becomes a very harsh, unloving, cold society. And that is another factor that we're seeing in the world today, where everybody's angry with each other. They're all wrapped up in politics and belief systems and abusing each other. And that is a product of a society moving toward Marxism. But I think because it's become so extreme, it's already starting to collapse. And I'm seeing elements of that happening in everyday society already. But we're going to have to ride out this decade, I believe. And this decade might be just a tough one, where both sides are butting up against each other. The establishment and the system is not going to give up. But meanwhile, people are going to start waking up to what's taking place. And as a result, the establishment is not going to be able to gain much more ground. They may keep pushing, but they're not going to make the progress they made up till last year. And then eventually we'll start seeing the pendulum swinging the other way, when more people become self-aware and realize they don't really want to live in this corrupt society. It's going to take some time and patience, but I think there's a lot of hope, even though at the moment it seems very hopeless.
Certainly on the physical plane, it does. And so I think for me personally, when I'm trying to find hope in, the future of where we're going, I look at all of the information we have beneath the surface vibrationally, which is typically coming through the guides. So for me, in the process of editing my book, I'm coming across a lot of great information about what this process is all about, which tells me we're on the right track. And I think that's what we ultimately have to keep in mind, despite all the things that are happening. So the reason I say this, that we're on the right track, is that in the third dimension, it was a very confined creative container, defined by hierarchies. We were in an enslavement system, and many of us still are today, where our pathways to source were hijacked and taken over by others. But the degree to which that is breaking down is equal to a raise in consciousness. We are now new human beings who require a different reality because we no longer fit in that old model. And that's ultimately why we see the darkness so dark. It's why we have so much stark contrast going on, because we actually have the ability to see things that have been going on forever, that we have merely been operating in this cloud of density and dust. So as that density and dust clears, we're going to see more. And this old structure, like I explained in the last podcast, is kind of like the girders of a building, right? It's become unstable. So the building is coming down, and it does have to collapse, because ultimately what we've created there is going to become more and more restrictive. So the reason we're so uncomfortable and we feel like we have no freedom is that we're trying to hold on to a reality that is no longer sustainable. But the new already exists, and that's truly where the hope lies. But unfortunately, the tough part is we're the ones who are each individually managing that shift, first for ourselves and our families, and then for the collective, into this new reality. And we talk about it all the time. It's very uncertain because things aren't stable there either. So we find ourselves in this really, interesting and wonky place where, the guides say it's really a fantastic opportunity to be here right now, which is, it's hard to look at it that way. But the fantastic opportunity is we're like in the eye of the storm with all of this stuff swirling around us that we can see so clearly that we don't want. But because we're in the center, we're the ones that are directing that energy across the plane of the earth into this brand new reality. So we get to take what's there and totally alchemize it. And so I think we have to start really small. And I think we have to do things very gradually. I don't think we can expect, the instantaneous manifestation that, the new earth that a lot of people are talking about, the solar flash and the white hats. I think just like me trying to manifest that very unrealistic relationship for me, that's what that is all about. And it's creating a lot of suffering because I don't think it can possibly happen that way. If we're here to savor every moment, and we know things are going to get a little challenging, then we're going to have to really slow down and make sure we're bringing things in our lives that we want, that, not only that we want for ourselves, but that we want for everyone else. And it is going to take some risk, right? But that's the fantastic opportunity is, we think there's no safety net. We think we're making these choices and taking these risks. And, we have no idea whether it's going to come to full fruition. But I think that's what we're here to prove to ourselves, is that we can actually make this happen. And another thing in the book that I recently read that I think is really interesting is there's this intelligent process when a planet is going through a timeline collision or a timeline convergence. And that's ultimately what this is. So that tornado that's swirling around us, it's cosmic timelines, earthly timelines. We're experiencing the worst of the worst and the best of the best. So we're reviewing the cataclysms, the Great Flood, wartime, genetic manipulation, but we also have at our fingertips the experiences of ancient civilizations that we're now, renewing, and periods when pyramids were constructed, enlightened civilizations. We have at our fingertips that knowledge as well. And so we get to use all of that in order to move ourselves along. But what the universe does is it has to kind of organize the field. And so this great divide that we see in the human collective where everyone's taking sides, right? We know a lot of that is seeded by those in power, whether it's race, class, political affiliation, all that stuff is seeded. What I'm talking about more so is where you can't have these conversations with your neighbor or your family. The divide in consciousness is becoming so stark. And that's because everyone gets supported at the level they are. And we tend to forget that. So we see people who aren't awakened yet, and we want to save them or somehow convince them. And we feel it's our duty to do something. And in the book, they say it's really not your duty to do something, because what this divide is an intentional and organized system of a conscious universe that's vibrationally supporting everyone exactly where they are to make this shift in the way most comfortable. And so we have to keep that in mind as well, with all of the ego out there, and right, all of the differences that we have in opinion and in vibration and consciousness. It's really that we're seeing this organizational process in action. So you brought up 2033, and that can sound really defeating. So what I want to add is that in my private sessions, what I notice about people who come to these conversations or who are, spiritual leaders, way showers, that sort of thing, is that 2025 for people's personal lives feels like a big, big turning point. I'm not saying everything on the planet's going to turn around and be amazing by 2025, but I feel like a lot of people are stepping into new modalities, right? Practices. I think it's where some of the breakdown of the old is going to become so real that people are going to have no choice other than to step into their, what they're here to do, literally what they're here to do, to serve the human collective. And so I think that's hopeful, because that's where we're going to see some of these things like free energy technology, or, the interface of alternative and conventional medicine. The guides even say like ancient gardening traditions coming back to heal the soil and things. Not that it's going to happen overnight, but I think that's the beginning of this period of, communities starting to form, people starting to come into their rhythm. Those of us who might be here on the leading edge, which I don't like to use that as a judgmental thing, but we know, right? We know that a lot of us are here leading the way. And so I do think that by the time we get to 2025, people are going to feel more motivated, even though next year might feel tough. That motivation is going to really come in for people to start doing things that are going to make the biggest difference.
Well, I agree with you on 2025, actually, because we've talked about this before. Chiron entered Aries in 2020, and 2020 was when we got to the final stage of this pendulum swinging to one extreme. And so in 2020, Chiron entered Aries, and then it leaves Aries, I believe, 2026 or something like that. So this whole period of time has been organized around Chiron and Aries types of issues. And so if we look back historically in the past, when Chiron was in Aries, we see things like wars, we see identity politics, or things of that nature. That's why there's so much of an obsession in society today about identity. And also, Aries is more of an ego kind of expression. So we're seeing egos of individuals becoming so overly amplified, where people are so focused on themselves that they stomp all over everybody else just because their viewpoint is a little bit different or something. So everybody, when you have Chiron and Aries, people push their opinions and their identities on top of everybody else and expect everyone else to comply, because Aries can be so aggressive in energy. And of course, the children being born today or during this time have Chiron and Aries, and they're here to sort of deal with those issues in their lifetime. And so in this window of time is why we're seeing these things happen in society today. Is also Aries, you'll see world leaders becoming emboldened to push forward their agendas because it's all about them, right? Aries is an Aryan energy. Hitler, for example, was most people don't realize it wasn't really about persecuting the Jews only. He was really the whole Nazi Party was founded on a metaphysical movement. It was an occult movement that just had this manifestation that most people know about. But ultimately, he was seeking to find the Aryan race that he believed he was one of. And of course, Aries as a race or as an energy is a very aggressive, self-centered, egocentric energy. We've seen that in the recent years, and now in 2025, 26, that shifts, and we already turned the corner, even though we're not there yet. I think whenever we get to like 15 degrees of a particular sign, a planet or asteroid or whatever, you start to tilt the other way in the new direction. So now we're moving toward Chiron in Taurus, but in 2026 is when it finally flips. And I think that's when we're going to start leaving a lot of these ideas behind, and people are going to settle back down a little bit in terms of this angry, aggressive behavior. And then we're going to move into the Taurus stage, which, as I've mentioned before, the Great Depression was in Chiron and Taurus. So we start dealing with things having to do with self-worth and money. And at that point, we have to deal with the economic impact of what's happened in recent years as well. but definitely that'll feel better, I think, for a lot of people. And I think also people stop being so mad and mean to each other. And we may be able to get back to a little bit more of a supportive society where we can get along a little bit better. And a lot of it is going to be because, as you say, more people are going to start realizing what's been going on in the world in this period of time as well. And as a result, and also because the economic environment will be to such a degree that people have to worry about more basic things. Like, for example, we've discussed this before, how identity politics, or even politics in general, is really a phenomena of societies that have more wealth or affluence. If you are struggling to put food on your table, you don't care about your identity, for example. You're not concerned about going to war. You're just trying to feed yourself to get by, right? So I think when we get to the point where the economic climate gets bad enough, people out of necessity are going to more have to work together and focus on their basic needs and leave behind all this other stuff that is not really contributing to their well-being or happiness or society as a whole. We right now have that luxury because in recent decades, economically, we've reached such a I don't want to say high point, because in many ways it's actually a very low point, but in terms of a state of abundance has sort of existed, especially in Western countries, but globally, really. Even China, for example, their economy was booming until the last few years. So this is a phenomena that we reach in the world, and when you have that, people start, in a lower vibrational consciousness anyway, start concerning themselves with things that really aren't contributing to the betterment of society. But that will shift in 2025, 26.
And in the interim, I think finding hope in your own life is the best place to look and to develop it, because the world is going to be chaotic and things are going to be breaking down, and right, the whole system is going to be crumbling. So there's going to be a lot of instability, and we're not used to that. We're used to looking outside of ourselves, for saviors and good news, but we are the ones who have to generate that good news and hope within ourselves, within our homes, within our families. And Ethann and I have addressed this so many times in the various podcasts, whether it's, the simple things that you bring into your home, like, color, things that bring you joy, making your life very purposeful, or tapping into some of those fifth dimensional timeline potentials. For me, that's been health, bringing in really cool things like a rife, to use in my home. I think these things, and they don't have to be expensive, that you put into application in your own life, as selfish as that seems, is going to set the foundation for your service in the future. And I think this is the time, because if that 2025 mark in my, most of my readings is any indication of the uprising of Lightworkers, then now is the time for those of us who are in these movements, who have lost hope, to really find it first for ourselves and to set that stable foundation such that we're going to be able to help as many people as we can as we move into the coming years.
I just want to briefly touch on the idea of this being so difficult and people not wanting to be here during this time. And I look at it as, well, imagine if you could have been a fly on the wall during the fall of Rome or the end of Atlantis. I mean, we've talked in Channel Revelations, I've talked with Thoth about what it was like for him to be in Atlantis, and all of a sudden there was the cataclysm, and he had to, in many ways, descend down to the third dimension, fifth dimension, third dimension in Egypt, and how it was very difficult for him to have that experience. I think in many respects, there's a human side of us that is walking this life, and we're witnessing these things, and it's difficult. And much like he seemed like he was very saddened and disheartened by having to go from this ninth dimensional Atlantean society to a third to fifth dimensional Egyptian society, and how difficult that was for him. I think that's in many respects what a lot of people are experiencing today, is being in this time. But on the other hand, we get to witness this amazing time on the planet when everything is about to change, and to reinvent society and create something newer and better. And that pivotal moment in our history has only occurred a handful of times throughout history. I mean, for the most part, we're coasting along in a particular direction, but we happen to be at this final intensification before we give birth to something new. And in many respects, it can be disheartening as a being walking the earth during that time, living in that world. But if you can take a step back for a moment and try to peer into this reality as a higher dimensional being, and the excitement that it would be to actually walk the earth and watch these things happen during this time. Yeah, I think to be here and be happy during this time, you have to hold both perspectives. You have to walk in this world and deal with the circumstances of being human and being here now, but also be an observer and realize that this is an exciting time to witness these things. And if you can just take a look around at what's actually happening in the world and watch it change, it will be a time worthy of remembering and having experienced, I think.
I think that's a good place to wrap it up. We didn't get through too many of the questions this time, but keep them coming, the questions and comments, and we'll share more in a future episode. So thanks for joining us for the Awaken Empowered podcast. We'll be back next week with another Channeled Revelations.